Please be advised that some of the audio that you will hear during this series may be uncomfortable and triggering.
Gloria and her 8-year-old daughter Whitney say they escaped a so-called cult which they say treated children poorly.
They treated kids bad. They screamed at some kids. They spanked them. People would scream at nighttime, having bad nightmares. People would try to get out, but they couldn't.
You mean kids would try to get away?
Mm-hmm.
Whitney got away after her mother left the group after 15 years. Gloria is a recovering alcoholic, married 4 times, mother of 3, currently in a custody battle over one of her other children with an ex-husband, a man she claims is still a cult member. Gloria says she fears for the lives of her children, especially after she and the kids got a visit one day from a cult member.
He got a steak knife. He held my hair against the sink. He stabbed me in the neck with a steak knife.
What he told me was that I was the devil and that to save the world he was supposed to kill Whitney.
Gloria says her daughter wasn't seriously hurt and her attacker was arrested. Stories like Gloria's should be carefully examined.
Something happens when you listen to someone else talk about their trauma. It begins to take hold inside of you and create a deeper consciousness of the situation. Maybe that's why so many of us are drawn to the chaos and disbelief of cults and other insidious groups of mind and body control. We seek to understand the mayhem and make sense of the atrocities that are committed. How could someone or some group of people treat others this way? Sometimes the answer is just chilling, like in the case of the nurse who is believed to have killed 400 patients in hospitals in the 90s and the early 2000s. His answer when asked why he did it: because no one stopped me. Life can be cruel, and cults often represent the peak of that cruelty in our world.
I'll tell you who I am. As to whether or not you believe who I am or not is up to you.
When you call Jesus, really you have called me.
I'm a convict. I'm an outlaw. I'm a rebel. I'm not a Sunday school teacher.
In the shadows of cult leaders, it's not uncommon to find children. Dozens have been housed at the Koresh compound in Texas.
Cults generally want the members to be working a lot. They want them to be slaving away and doing all kinds of things. So kids get in the way. So cults will tend to shove kids in the background. They're an inconvenience.
Chapter 3: Serena's Childhood.
I was born in David Berg's house, in the cult leader's house. My birth was the 4th in a line of succession or golden children, as you were, in Berg's house. The first 2 children were Davidito, his adopted son, and Techi, his adopted daughter, both biological children of Karen Zerby. The third one was Davida Kelly, my older sister, and then there was me. Davida Kelly was not conceived in Berg's home. My mother was pregnant with her, and she was born right before she went to Berg's household to take care of Berg's children. My mother was sent there to be a nanny for Berg's children. And during that time, I was conceived. So right away from before I was born, my entire life was it was exactly planned and documented in cult publications. So there were multiple publications of how to baby-proof a house and how to raise a child, how a pregnant woman should eat. Very harmless things, but written out and documented about my life and my mother's pregnancy with me. My entire birth was also documented in a publication called Lifelines about how I was born. And the second I was born, I was given a cult publication name, a pseudonym named Mary Dear. And my entire childhood in Berg's household was documented in a series called Life with Grandpa. And it talked about David, Techi, Davida, And me, Mary Dear, was Berg's name for me, and he also named me Serena. And then it was all about my life and the adventures of my life. And we were very secluded, us four in Berg's household. We had no contact with other cult members because Berg was constantly in hiding because authorities were always after him. People were always trying to catch him. There were always raids. So we moved around under cover of darkness. We never used our legal names. So the rest of the cult, of the family of the Children of God, knew me as Mary Dear. But I had no contact with the outside world. It was just the people that I was living with in Berg's compound, which was probably about 50 people at the most at any time. And then when I was 5, I left Berg's house with my parents and we moved to Japan. And so I came from a tiny house, not knowing anyone for the first 5 years of my life, except the same 30 to 50 people, to going into the largest or second largest compound in the Family International, which was in Japan, in Tokyo. And it was a compound with 300 members. And that's where they made all the videos for the cult publications and the videos and the things that they would use to brainwash us. And so we went in there and I was taught to lie about who I was. They said, "You're not Mary Dear, you're Serena." My mother changed her name from Sarah to Ruth. So she was named Ruth in Japan. And we were just some family that came from the Philippines. So very early on, it was instilled in me, like, first of all, it's not safe who you are and you can't tell anyone who you are. And also if you do, you will be punished. So I was kept very much under control and very separated from the rest of the group for a while. And by the group, I mean, the 10 to 20 other children that were my age. As each children were separated, as soon as they were about 2 or 3, they were brought to different rooms and we slept with other kids our age, and we had classes and we saw our parents on the weekend. We didn't see our parents for the rest of the week, but that whole time I was lying about who I was, and we were just a normal family in the cult. 2 years later, when I was almost 7, I moved to Brazil with my mom and the rest of my family. And in Brazil, it was the same thing. My mom again changed her name to Sharon. I was still Serena, but the Mary Dear name was hidden. I was not allowed to talk about who I was. So we again went to a very large compound in Rio, in Brazil. And since these publications were circulated about my life and my sister's lives and David and Tetchy, they would read them in class. And people would ask questions. The kids would say, ask the adults we had to refer to them as uncles and aunties. So there was a child one day that said, "Uncle James, how old is Mary Dear now?" And he calculated, well, she was born in 1983. So she would be 6 years old, your age, Serena. And I had to sit there and be like, "Oh, wow." And everyone's like, "Wow, Mary Dear's your age." And I sat there as a 6-year-old and I was like, "Wow, that's amazing. Mary Dear's my age." Like, the amount of, and it came naturally to me by that time because I had already been doing it for 2 years. And I just sat there and lied about who I was, as a 6-year-old child. And it just went on from there. As I grew up in Brazil, I started to get very restless. I was always kept in more secluded homes and wasn't allowed to socialize with a lot of children because of who I was and who my family was. And people would ask questions: where did you grow up? Who were your parents? Where are you from? And they didn't want me to spill any secrets of who I really was. But as a teenager, that's when you start becoming extremely valuable to the cult because you've been taking care of children since you were 10. Now I speak Portuguese, so I know the language. So that means I can go out and I can beg on the streets for money. So luckily for me, that was my kind of way of escape, was to go out on the streets, beg for money. I could socialize with other people. And then when they realized I was cute and I was blonde and I was tall in Brazil, they sent me out on the streets even more. And then I was able to go to other compounds in Sao Paulo a city next to Rio, where I could socialize with other children my age. And even then, still lying the entire time about who I was. But to me, it was finally my way of being able to, I knew that I was not normal. I was very shy and very introverted as a child, and I didn't want to be that way because I was so scared of everything. I was so scared of talking about who I was and talking about my life. So in Sao Paulo, I was kind of able to come out of my shell a little bit and interact with other people. And even though, yes, I was begging on the streets every day and singing on sidewalks for restaurants for money, but I was out of the house. I was always locked up in the house. I never saw any other children. I could never speak to anyone that was not in the house that I was living in. So being able to be in Sao Paulo gave me that ability to interact with other teenagers from the cult. That lasted a few years, and then again we left Brazil and went to Mexico. So I was 15 at that time. I was brought into another very secret home called WS, World Services, which were the top 4 secret compounds, basically just like a home I had been born into, just like Berg's compound. There were a few other secret homes that would write and publish all of the cult publications and then send them out to the rest of the cult. So yet again, I was locked up, the only person my age, in a home of probably 40 to 50 people in Mexico, no contact with other people my age at all. And I was extremely upset and angry and depressed, but I had to wait until I was able to do anything, with my mom giving me permission. And as soon as I turned 16, I demanded that I go live in Dallas with my dad, who had also been kicked out of WS. So we kind of got kicked out of this, dishonorably discharged from in the family. And I ended up in Dallas with him and was pretty much doing the same thing, but again, begging on the streets for money, acting out a lot, sneaking out of the house, taking drugs, hanging out with kids, like trying to get some sort of freedom in my life. I was kicked out of that home as well. And then I was sent to Houston, where shortly after that, I got an opportunity to go to Guatemala. So I went to Guatemala just as soon as I left WS. I was kind of on my own, floating around, but I still wasn't 18, so I wasn't allowed to actually do anything that I wanted to do. And went down to Guatemala, which is where I met Olivia when I was 17. And I was living in a house down there. There were 2 or 3 houses in Guatemala. I stayed there. I pretty much bided my time until I couldn't take it anymore. And I was so unhappy. I went back to the US and I decided to partially leave the cult and I lived in a campground with some other members who were allowed to leave but couldn't quite yet leave because there were a bunch of children under 18, such as myself. And then I just kind of sat around doing nothing. So I went back to Texas finally and got my GED and got my driver's license because I was about to be 18. The second I turned 18, I left and moved in with a friend in Houston who had already left as well and was staying with her boyfriend. And from there, I just started trying to do whatever I could to make money. And that's kind of how I got to being born as a child celebrity in the cult, to kind of just floating around, not really doing anything with my life in the beginning. And that just started a whole other series of how I left the cult and my experiences there, which were of course very traumatic and different. But as far as me growing up in the cult and who I was and my experiences, that was pretty much the basic rundown of my life.
Our ideas about sex growing up are often poorly taught and discussed, if they are even mentioned at all. All of us are behind the 8 ball, if you will, when it comes to this. But imagine if how you were taught about sex was through the lens of a maniac leader who used the benevolence of Jesus as a cover for spreading illegal and horrific ideas about sex.
Yeah, sexuality was a huge thing in the cult. That was basically something that we were taught from a very, very early age, especially as a female in the cult. As females in the cult, our job was to love Jesus, to love the other men in the cult, to have babies, and to make money and bring in money, and to clean and cook. Like, that was it. That's it. And so women were often passed around as men. And for me personally, growing up, I saw this. My mother was actually one of the top FFers at Flirty Fishing women, and she ended up being so good in Berg's house that she became a madam of sorts and started bringing other women out with her to these bars and to these restaurants and sending them out to go flirty fish, and they would go and give my mom the money. So she started in that way. And then in the house itself, I witnessed her having sex with all the men in the home. I saw it myself because it would happen in the same room that I was sleeping in, or it would be happening in orgies in Berg's house. So especially in Berg's house, I would say from 0 to 4 years old, I was exposed to sex all the time on a daily basis. Berg had a lot of drunken orgies. He had a lot of women doing strip teases in his home, and he filmed a lot of sexual videos. It was called Glorify God in the Dance, where he would have the women perform strip teases for him. And I was allowed to watch these videos because I was told, I'm going to do this one day, and this is going to be great. Now, did I realize that one day meant, next year when I was 3? No, I didn't realize that, but it did happen. So early on in Berg's house, I was taken down to a basement, and as a 3-year-old child, where there were some other children, including my older sister, in front of cameras with very bright lights. Now I'm 3 and I'm in a dark basement, and I'm stripped of my clothes and put a lei around my bare chest and a hula skirt on at 3, and was put in a basement, and all I see are these bright lights, and they turn on this Hawaiian music and they say, now you need to dance, and start dancing. And I look around and I see my older sister and other kids doing a dance, and they were telling us to strip and to slowly take off our clothes. And I just froze. I was stunned, and I just went into complete catatonic mode. I could not speak, I could not move. And they actually got mad at me after trying to encourage me to do this dance multiple times. They got mad because they said I was ruining the video. So I got taken out, and I got beaten and then thrown into a room by myself without dinner or anything for the rest of the night, because I was being bad and I was out of God's will. And to me, that punishment was so worth it to get out of that video, which I suddenly understood that if I cry and I make myself ugly, they won't like me and I won't be desirable for these, which, as we know, is child pornography videos. So there were multiple other times where I was forced to get up and do strip teases in front of adults in the home in Berg's household. A lot of drinking, a lot of drunk men. My sister was 10 and 12. These were very, very small underage children that Berg had us stripping and parading around the house. And we were told to sit on uncle's laps, who would grope us and sexually molest us. So those first 4 years were probably the most traumatizing of my life, not to mention also when I turned 3, which apparently was Berg's age for free-for-all sex with children. I was married to Berg and given a ring. I was brought to him in his house. He had a separate house on the property where I grew up. And basically I was put on his lap, and he presented me a ring. It was a heart-shaped ring, and I was 3. It was too big for my finger. So he wrapped tape around it, and he said, as I grow up, I can take the tape off, but the ring will still fit me as an adult, and I can keep it with me forever because I'll be his forever, which is sick, the fact that he put that much thought into how he can own this child for the rest of his life, how he can manipulate this child and keep it as his little trophy, his present. So I still have the ring, and he's right, it did fit me. It still fits on my pinky finger. Obviously, I'd never wear it ever, but I keep it as a remembrance, and I've always kept it because I knew I was going to tell my story, and I knew there were going to be a lot of doubters, but I was not the only person that was given this ring. My older sister was, and multiple other young girls in the household. I just happened to be the youngest of who had this wedding marriage ceremony to Berg. So immediately from being a very young child, I was extremely traumatized and abused and with sex, and my experience with sex. I actually hid because of those experiences and making the videos and realizing that I could get out of things by crying and being unhappy and looking ugly is kind of how I turned into a tomboy growing up in my teenage years. So I wore very baggy clothes. I cut my hair. We weren't allowed to cut our hair, so I cut it as short as I could without getting into too much trouble. And that actually helped me from a lot of abuse later on growing up, but obviously it didn't save me from anything. I was sexually molested and assaulted by teenage boys all up from when I was 10 to until I left Brazil, which was 15, so 10 to 15. You know, the trauma and the sexual abuse went down into the generations as these teenage boys who were 18, 19, 20 were doing the same things that were done to them. So they were just repeating these behaviors and these patterns of sexual abuse, except to me, who was much younger. And that entire time, I kind of retracted deeper and deeper into my shell and tried to avoid at all costs. I'm very tall. I'm 5'10". I walked with a slump, and I always looked down. I never made eye contact, just different things. Anything that I could do to make myself look unattractive to the men in the cult was what I could do. That just meant less abuse and less sexual predator attention.
In our next episode, stay tuned for Heather's story.